My name is Samantha Reyes. I am 37, a forensic accountant, and a mother who learned that silence can keep a family dinner peaceful while teaching the wrong people they are allowed to hurt you. At my parents' barbecue, my 10-year-old reached toward a tray of cupcakes I had paid for. My sister knocked his hand away before his fingers touched one. "Those are only for children with promising futures," she said, smiling as though cruelty became harmless when delivered softly. My child froze. My mother stared at her plate. My father nodded toward the gate and said, "He can eat when you get home." No one defended him. I did not argue. I folded the foil over the food I had brought, lifted the catering trays, took the cooler beside the grill, and walked out with my child. Behind us, someone shouted that I was being dramatic. I kept walking because I finally understood they were not waiting for me to explain my pain. They were waiting for me to surrender again. At exactly 11:15 p.m. Pacific time, my phone showed 74 missed calls and messages. My sister had called 27 times. My parents had called 21. The rest came from a lawyer, board members, employees, and a bank vice president. I turned the phone face down and let it ring. They thought I had left because of a cupcake. They had no idea what I had taken with me or what their promising future had been built on. Before I tell you what my father said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? Where are you watching from? And what is the weather like there? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. My child's name was Ethan, and by the time we reached my car, he had stopped asking why his aunt had said it. That frightened me more than tears would have. Tears meant a wound was still asking to be seen. Silence meant he was already deciding where to hide it. He climbed into the back seat, buckled himself in, and placed both hands in his lap. "Mom," he said after I started the engine, "do they think I'm stupid?" The question stripped every excuse I had ever made for my family down to the bone. I pulled back into the driveway, turned off the engine, and looked at him. "No," I said. "Some adults confuse grades, money, and trophies with character. That is their mistake, not your identity." He nodded, but he did not look convinced. Ethan had struggled with reading speed since first grade, yet he could take apart a broken radio, identify the failed component, and rebuild it without instructions. His teachers called him inventive. My sister called him unfocused. My parents repeated whichever description came from the person they considered more successful. That person had always been Michelle. I had not used her name at the barbecue because, in my mind, naming her would have made the scene feel ordinary. Just another fight between sisters. It was not ordinary. Michelle was 40, polished, persuasive, and skilled at turning humiliation into advice. She ran Beacon Learning Group, a private tutoring company that promised to discover the future inside every child. What almost no one outside the company knew was that Beacon existed because of me. 6 years earlier, Michelle had brought me a business plan written in colored marker across 14 poster boards. I created the financial model, negotiated the first lease, invested the money left to me by our grandmother, and personally guaranteed the credit line. In exchange, my holding company owned 55% of Beacon. The remaining shares belonged to Michelle and two small investors. We agreed that she would be the public founder while I handled risk, compliance, and expansion behind the scenes. She said she needed a success that felt like her own. In reality, it was the same bargain I had made since childhood. Michelle received the applause, and I received permission to remain in the room. The barbecue was supposed to celebrate Beacon's largest expansion yet. On Monday morning, the bank was scheduled to release a $2.1 million construction loan for 3 new locations. My signature was required at closing because my company owned the controlling interest and because the loan depended on my guarantee. Michelle had spent months introducing the expansion as proof that she had built an empire from nothing. She had even placed reserved cupcakes beneath a gold sign that read, "For our future leaders." I had ordered the cupcakes and spent 7 weekends correcting Michelle's projections. Still, when he reached for one, she acted as though he was contaminating a prize he had not earned. My parents' silence hurt because it was familiar. My father, Gerald, excused cruelty when it came from successful people. My mother, Patricia, called appeasement family peace. When Dad told Ethan he could eat at home, He was not making a decision about dessert. He was confirming the hierarchy. Michelle's image first, his grandchild's dignity second, my objections last. How many times can a person call surrender keeping the peace before peace becomes another name for permission? As I drove away, Michelle sent her first message. Bring the food back. Guests are asking questions. Her next message said, do not make business decisions while emotional. That was the message that changed the temperature inside me. She understood immediately that I had the power to stop Monday's closing. She simply believed I would never use it. At a red light, I opened the secure folder on my phone and read the draft email I had prepared 2 weeks earlier, but had been too afraid to send. It concerned irregular transfers, missing scholarship records, and enrollment figures that did not match the company's tax filings. I had planned to confront Michelle privately after the expansion. I had told myself that waiting protected the employees. The truth was uglier. Waiting protected me from my parents' disappointment. Ethan watched the messages light up the dashboard. Are we in trouble? He asked. No, I said, and for the first time that day, I believed my own answer. We're done accepting it. I drove home, reheated soup, and gave him the chocolate cupcake I had packed before leaving. Then, while he built a small motor from spare parts at the kitchen table, I opened my laptop and stopped protecting the people who had never protected him. I did not send one angry message. I opened Beacon's operating agreement and followed it line by line. Section 9.2 allowed the majority owner to suspend a pending financing when credible evidence suggested that financial information supplied to a lender might be inaccurate. I attached the unmatched transfers, the conflicting enrollment reports, and the email in which Michelle had ordered our bookkeeper to classify personal promotional expenses as student outreach. At 8:41 p.m., I notified the bank that I could not certify the closing package. At 8:49, I requested an emergency independent audit. At 9:03, I informed the board that no funds should move until the audit committee reviewed the discrepancies. Then I called my attorney, Vanessa Cho, and asked one question. Can I protect the company without protecting Michelle? Vanessa had represented Beacon since its first lease. She knew every concession I had made, and every time Michelle had called basic oversight a personal attack. You can, she said, but once the bank receives this, she will know the era of informal forgiveness is over. It ended in my parents' backyard, I replied. The decision felt like opening sealed envelopes in reverse order. The newest document sat on top, a marketing invoice for $38,000. Beneath it was a transfer to a luxury event company owned by Michelle's friend. Beneath that was a scholarship ledger with 13 names, but only 7 signed applications. Beneath that was an email from our operations director asking why Michelle had raised projected enrollment by 45% 3 days before the loan package went to the bank. For months, I had noticed small fractures. Michelle insisted they were timing differences, clerical errors, or the cost of thinking bigger. I corrected them quietly because the centers employed 51 people and served more than 750 families. Usefulness had become her shield. Every time I questioned her, she reminded me how many tutors depended on her vision. Every time I mentioned governance, my father said I was jealous because Michelle was the face of the company. Every time I considered enforcing the agreement, my mother asked whether paperwork was worth losing a sister. No one asked what I was losing by staying. At 9:40, Michelle called. I declined it. At 9:43, Dad called. I declined that too. At 9:48, my mother left a voicemail. Please call before your sister says something she cannot take back. Even then, the emergency in her mind was what Michelle might say, not what Michelle had already done. Ethan had gone to bed by 10 o'clock. But before he did, he placed his half-built motor beside my laptop. It doesn't work yet, he said. That doesn't mean it never will. I stared at him because the sentence was so simple and so far beyond anything my family had offered him that afternoon. After I tucked him in, I returned to the documents. At 10:16, Vanessa forwarded a notice from the bank. The closing was postponed pending review. At 10:28, the board chair confirmed an emergency meeting for Sunday morning. At 10:42, Beacon's chief operating officer wrote that Michelle had ordered staff to continue announcing the expansion as fully funded. That instruction turned my concern into something more serious. Continuing to market at unfunded locations could expose the company to claims from families and landlords. I instructed the operations officer, not Michelle, to pause all expansion advertising. At 10:57, the first investor called. At exactly 11:15, I counted the notifications. 74. Then Dad's name appeared again. This time I answered, placed the call on speaker, and said nothing. He did not ask about Ethan. He did not ask whether we had arrived home safely. He said, "Fix what you did before Monday, or you will regret making your sister look small." The sentence settled something inside me. "Dad," I said, "Michelle made herself look small. I only stopped making her look solvent." He inhaled sharply. In the background, I heard Michelle shouting that the bank had frozen the deal, Mom crying, and someone demanding to know who had contacted the board. Dad lowered his voice. "This company is her future." "No," I replied. "It is an asset she manages for other owners, employees, and families." She forgot the difference. He said blood mattered more than numbers. I looked toward Ethan's room and asked, "Whose blood?" Silence. It was the first question all evening that no one could twist into an accusation. Dad warned me that if the expansion failed, I would be blamed. "Then they should read the audit," I said. "Good night." I ended the call, turned off the ringer, and slept better than I had in years. By morning, Michelle had not apologized. Instead, she had begun a campaign to make me the villain. She told employees I was trying to seize her company, told relatives I had punished her over a child's dessert, and told the investors I was unstable. She believed the loudest version of a story became the truth. Sunday's emergency board meeting began at 9 o'clock in the morning. Michelle joined from my parents' dining room, framed by the same gold banner that had hung over the cupcakes. She had changed clothes, fixed her hair, and arranged her expression into the calm concern she used for donors. Dad sat at one side of her. Mom sat at the other. Neither was a shareholder, officer, or employee, but Michelle had invited them as family observers, hoping their presence would make me retreat into the role they preferred. Vanessa attended with me. The two minority investors joined remotely, along with our operations director and an independent auditor named Derek Foss. Michelle opened by calling the postponement a misunderstanding caused by my emotional reaction at a family event. She said the financial questions were routine and that I had weaponized my ownership to punish her. Then she looked directly into the camera and added, "Samantha has always struggled when attention is not centered on her." 5 years earlier, that sentence would have sent me into a frantic defense of my character. That morning, I asked Derek to share his screen. The first spreadsheet showed that Beacon had reported 910 active students to the bank, while its billing system showed 664. Michelle said the difference represented committed families. Derek asked for signed contracts. She had none. The second document showed $97,000 withdrawn from a restricted scholarship account over 16 months. Michelle claimed the money-funded community outreach. Derek displayed invoices for a private launch dinner, custom furniture for her home office, personal styling, and a week at a resort where she had filmed promotional videos for less than 4 hours. Dad interrupted to say successful executives needed to maintain an image. Vanessa reminded him that restricted scholarship money was not an image budget. Michelle's smile tightened, but she still looked more offended than afraid. She said every expense had benefited the brand, and the brand benefited the children. Then Derek opened a folder titled Future Initiative Source Material. I had never seen it before. Inside were photographs of Ethan's science notebooks, sketches of a low-cost moisture sensor he had built for our balcony plants, and a recording of him explaining how the device could help community gardens avoid wasting water. 6 months earlier, Michelle had visited our apartment while I was sick. Ethan had proudly shown her his project. She praised him, asked to photograph the pages, and said she wanted to show a teacher who might help him. I had considered that visit evidence that she could be kind when no audience was present. Derek clicked to the next file. Beacon's grant application for a $275,000 innovation award. The centerpiece was a student-developed environmental sensor program. The diagrams had been redrawn, but the measurements, unusual phrasing, and even one misspelled label matched Ethan's notebook. The application credited Michelle as the creator of the curriculum and described the original student contributor only as a participant in a pilot exercise. Beacon had been selected as a finalist. Michelle planned to announce the award at Monday's loan closing. My body went cold, but my voice did not. "Did Ethan or I authorize the use of his work?" I asked. Michelle glanced at Dad before answering. "It was a child's craft project. I developed it into something useful." There it was. the whole family system in one sentence. What belonged to us became hers when it had value. What hurt us became insignificant when acknowledging it would cost her. I asked whether she had called his project useless when she took it. Michelle said I was distorting her words. Derek then played an audio memo attached to the grant folder. Michelle's voice filled the meeting. "Keep the boy's name out of it. His school record weakens the future leader narrative." No one spoke. Even Dad looked away. Was the cupcake comment cruel because it was spontaneous? Or worse, because it revealed a judgment Michelle had already converted into policy? I did not ask the question aloud. The documents asked it for me. One investor demanded an immediate vote to suspend Michelle as chief executive pending the audit. The other seconded it. Under the operating agreement, my majority vote would decide the result. Michelle leaned toward the camera. "You cannot do this to your own sister." "I am not doing this because you are my sister," I said. "I am doing it because you used restricted funds, inflated numbers, and took a child's work while arguing he had no future." Mom began crying. Dad told me to pause the vote and settle privately. I looked at them both. Privately is where this behavior survived. I voted yes. Michelle was suspended. Her access to company accounts was revoked, and all public announcements about the grant were canceled. She did not lose everything in that moment, but she lost the one thing she had treated as permanent: control. As the meeting ended, she whispered, "You will destroy Beacon, just to prove you matter." I closed my laptop and answered, "No. I am finally separating Beacon from the person destroying it." Michelle did not respond to suspension with reflection. She responded with a story. By noon, relatives were forwarding me a message she had posted in a private family group. My sister used her disabled child as an excuse to steal the company I built. Ethan was not disabled, and I had never described him that way. Michelle had chosen the word because she knew our relatives would either pity him or question his ability, and both reactions served her. I took a screenshot, sent it to Vanessa, and refused to answer in the group. 10 minutes later, Michelle posted a photograph of herself outside Beacon with a caption about surviving betrayal. Employees began receiving calls from parents asking whether the centers were closing. Tutors worried about their paychecks. She had been suspended to protect the company, yet she was willing to frighten every family attached to it if fear helped restore her authority. I authorized the operations director to send a factual notice. All current centers would remain open. Payroll was secure, and an independent review concerned only the expansion and executive conduct. No names, no accusations, no family details. That contrast mattered. Michelle needed an audience. I needed a record. By afternoon, the record grew worse. Derek found that she had submitted Ethan's photographs to the grant committee after removing identifying metadata. He also found 3 emails in which she instructed a marketing contractor to describe the sensor project as evidence that Beacon's methods could transform underperforming children into future innovators. Ethan had never been enrolled at Beacon. Michelle had used his work to prove her program's success, while using his academic struggles to erase him from the credit. When Vanessa contacted the Grant Foundation, its counsel requested the source files and immediately suspended Beacon's application. The foundation also notified the local education partnership that had featured Michelle as a keynote speaker. By evening, the keynote invitation was withdrawn. That was when her husband Ryan called me. He had stayed mostly silent at the barbecue, busy near the grill while Michelle blocked Ethan's hand. I had resented him for not intervening, but his voice now sounded less defensive than stunned. He said Michelle had told him the expansion was fully funded and the grant award nearly guaranteed. She had also told him that the company had paid back every dollar I invested. None of that was true. He asked whether the resort trip had really come from scholarship money. I sent him the auditor's preliminary list and told him to speak with his own lawyer. I did not ask him to leave her, expose her, or take my side. Revenge becomes corruption when it demands control over innocent people's choices. I wanted consequences tied to facts, not destruction tied to rage. Still, facts had their own force. Ryan discovered that Michelle had used their joint home equity line to cover personal expenses after the board rejected reimbursement. She had hidden the statements by changing the mailing address to Beacon's office. He moved into a hotel that night and froze their joint discretionary account. My parents called this catastrophe I had caused. Dad left a voicemail saying, "A decent sister would have warned her before involving outsiders." Then I opened the oldest document in the audit file, an email from 4 years earlier, in which I had warned Michelle that restricted money required separate accounting. Her reply read, "Stop acting like my supervisor. You are lucky I let you be part of my vision." I forwarded both messages to Dad with one sentence. She was warned. He did not answer. The next morning, Mom came to my apartment carrying a bakery box. I met her in the hallway so Ethan would not hear us. She held out 6 cupcakes as if symmetry could repair humiliation. "Your sister was wrong," she said, "but losing the loan, the grant, and maybe her marriage is too much." "Which consequence did I invent?" I asked. Mom blinked. "You started the audit." "No, I stopped preventing one." She asked me to reinstate Michelle long enough for the loan to close, promising the family would handle the rest privately. I told her the bank would not rely on numbers we could not verify, and I would not guarantee debt for an executive who had lied to lenders. Mom's expression hardened. "So you are choosing business over family." "Michelle chose herself over both." I pointed to the bakery box. "And you are still trying to replace accountability with dessert." She left the box on the floor and walked away. I threw it out unopened. That evening, Ethan asked why Grandma had visited. I told him the adults were dealing with a problem at work. He studied me for a moment and asked, "Is it because I touched the cupcake?" I knelt until we were eye to eye. "No, the cupcake showed me a problem that was already there." "You did nothing wrong." He exhaled, and the tension left his shoulders. That small release mattered more than every frantic call on my phone. Michelle had built her power by teaching people to carry guilt that belonged to her. I would not let her place even 1 gram of it on him. The final board hearing took place 11 days after the barbecue in Beacon's largest classroom. I chose the location because the company belonged to the students and employees affected by the decision, not to our family mythology. The board sat at a row of tables. Derek presented the completed audit. Vanessa attended as company counsel, and an outside employment attorney advised us on the suspension. Michelle arrived with her own lawyer, Ryan, and my parents. Ryan sat apart from her. My parents tried to sit beside the board until Vanessa explained that they were witnesses, not decision makers. For the first time in my life, someone enforced a boundary before I had to defend it. The audit confirmed that Michelle had diverted $132,600 in restricted and company funds, overstated projected enrollment, concealed related party vendors, and submitted Ethan's work without permission. It also found that she had instructed an employee to backdate 2 approval forms after the bank requested support. The employee had refused and preserved the messages. Michelle's lawyer argued that the spending reflected aggressive marketing, not theft, and that the numbers were optimistic estimates. Derek replied that optimism did not create signatures, students, or authorization. Then the operations director described years of intimidation. Michelle rewarded employees who supported her public image and excluded those who raised compliance concerns. 3 written statements followed. One tutor said Michelle had ordered her to remove a scholarship applicant because the child's parents would not photograph well. Another employee said Michelle had reserved program places for donors, while publicly claiming selection was need-based. The third described being told that compassion was bad branding. Michelle listened with her jaw set. When she finally spoke, she did not apologize. She said Beacon would never have grown without her willingness to make hard choices. She called the audit a technical ambush, and Ethan's project raw material that any competent educator could have improved. Ryan closed his eyes. Mom whispered her name as a warning. Dad stared at the floor. Michelle continued, looking at me. "Samantha has always wanted what I have. She hides behind spreadsheets because she cannot inspire people." I waited until she finished. "You are right about one thing," I said. "You inspired people. Some were inspired to stay silent. Some were inspired to change records. Some were inspired to believe children only matter when they improve your image. That is why inspiration without accountability is dangerous." The board voted on 4 resolutions. Michelle was removed as chief executive and terminated for cause. Her remaining ownership distributions would be withheld, as allowed by the operating agreement, until the company recovered misused funds and legal costs. The expansion was reduced from 3 locations to 1, funded without my personal guarantee after 8 months of verified performance. Beacon would notify affected donors, repay the scholarship account, and formally correct the grant submission to identify Ethan as the original creator. Finally, an independent executive would lead the company while employees elected a non-management representative to the board. Every resolution passed. Michelle lost her title, access, salary, public platform, and the right to present herself as the unquestioned founder. The Grant Foundation barred her from serving on its funded programs for 6 years. The education partnership canceled 2 additional appearances. Ryan's lawyer delivered a separation proposal after the hearing. Whether their marriage survived would be their decision, but secrecy would no longer make it easy. Michelle looked around the room as if waiting for Dad to reverse the vote through force of disappointment. He could not. "Say something," she demanded. Dad's face had aged in 11 days. "Did you take the boy's work?" he asked. Michelle answered, "That is not the point." Dad stood. "It is the only point I understand." He left the room. Mom followed, then stopped beside me. "Are you happy now?" she asked. It was the question families use when they want the person who exposed the damage to feel ashamed of the wreckage. "No," I said. "I am responsible now." Michelle heard me. For the first time, she had no room, title, parent, or frightened employee willing to translate her consequences into my cruelty. She gathered her papers and walked out alone. The consequences did not end when Michelle left the hearing. Real accountability rarely arrives as one dramatic collapse. It arrives in smaller doors that no longer open. Beacon removed her biography from its website. She sold her new car to begin reimbursing the company and placed her house on the market after Ryan refused to use joint savings to cover debts she had hidden. My parents asked to visit Ethan 3 weeks later. I met them first at a quiet cafe and gave them 3 conditions. They would not minimize the barbecue. They would not ask him to comfort them. And they would not mention Michelle's losses as though he had caused them. Dad bristled at being given rules. I reminded him that the last time he made the rules, a child was denied food in a yard full of adults. He lowered his eyes and agreed. During the visit, Mom told Ethan, "I should have spoken when your aunt was unkind." Dad took longer. He sat across from Ethan at our kitchen table, beside the repaired motor that now spun a tiny paper wheel. "What I said at the barbecue was wrong," he finally said. "You did not have to earn that cupcake, and you did not have to earn my protection." Ethan considered him with the seriousness children use when adults finally tell the truth. "Why didn't you say that then?" Dad opened his mouth, closed it, and answered, "Because I was afraid of upsetting the wrong person." Ethan looked toward me. I did not rescue Dad from the discomfort. "Was I the right person to upset?" he asked. Dad's face folded. "No." That was the first useful apology my father had ever given, because it did not ask to be admired. It simply named the failure. We did not become a healed family that afternoon. Healing is not a photograph taken after everyone says sorry. It is a pattern measured over time. My parents began therapy, stopped carrying Michelle's messages, and accepted that access to Ethan depended on consistent respect. Michelle herself sent no apology for nearly 6 weeks. Her first email described her losses, before saying she was sorry if Ethan misunderstood an adult joke. I replied with 2 sentences. "He understood you correctly. Contact me again only when you are prepared to name what you did without making him responsible for interpreting it." 4 weeks later, a second email arrived. It was shorter. She admitted she had taken his project because she believed crediting him would weaken the Grant story. She admitted the cupcake comment was meant to remind me that she controlled the family gathering. She admitted she had expected our parents to support her and me to retreat. Then she wrote, "I thought your silence meant I was stronger." I read that line twice. My silence had never been agreement, but I had used it so often that everyone, including me, had mistaken endurance for virtue. I did not forgive Michelle. I told her that any future contact would depend on repayment, cooperation with the company's corrective filings, individual therapy, and a direct apology to Ethan approved by his counselor. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would not restore her access to the places where she had caused harm. A boundary is not revenge postponed. It is the architecture that keeps revenge from becoming necessary again. Beacon survived, repaid the scholarship account, and published transparent selection criteria. We withdrew the 3-location expansion and opened one smaller center the following spring. The first room was a workshop where students could build, repair, and test ideas without being ranked by how impressive they looked on paper. The Grant Foundation allowed Beacon to submit a corrected application the next year. Ethan received full credit for the original sensor concept. But I refused a special award for him from the company because I did not want another adult institution using him to repair its image. Instead, The foundation invited him to demonstrate the project alongside other young inventors. He stood behind a folding table, explained the sensor in a voice that shook only once, and answered every question. At the end, a student asked whether he had always known the invention would work. Ethan smiled and said, "No, I just knew not working yet wasn't the same as having no future." I had to look away for a moment. Not because he had proven Michelle wrong, his worth had never depended on defeating her prediction. I looked away because he no longer carried her prediction as a question. On the anniversary of the barbecue, Ethan and I hosted a small cookout in the courtyard of our building. We invited friends, tutors, neighbors, and several Beacon families. The food sat on one long table where everyone served themselves. At the center was a tray of chocolate cupcakes. There were no labels, no reserved rows, and no adults deciding whose future qualified them for sweetness. Ethan took the first one, then handed the next to a shy child standing behind him. My phone stayed quiet in my pocket. The 74 calls that once felt like an approaching storm had become evidence of how many people panicked when one woman finally stopped absorbing the consequences meant for them. Michelle had lost the company she treated as a throne, the reputation she built from borrowed work, the financial security she risked for appearances, and the automatic loyalty of the family members who had protected her. I had lost something too, the fantasy that keeping everyone close was the same as keeping my child safe. It was a painful trade, but an honest one. So, tell me, when a family asks you to preserve peace by sacrificing someone quieter, is that peace worth keeping? And when the person causing the harm finally faces the cost, is that revenge? Or is it simply the bill arriving at the correct address? I watched Ethan laugh with chocolate frosting at the corner of his mouth and knew my answer. A promising future is not a prize handed out by the loudest person at the table. It begins the moment someone refuses to let cruelty define who deserves a place there. Thank you for joining us through this story. All characters, conversations, and outcomes are fictional and created only for entertainment and dramatic reflection. We hope you remember that someone can be part of your past without deserving a place in your future. Growth sometimes means honoring what you learned without returning to what hurt you.